Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of my Cedar Point Recreation Park. Today we're heading back to Frontier Town to work on the ride buildings for a couple rides that are still left to go back here. Getting pretty close to finishing all of our flat rides, but there's still a couple stragglers back here that we only sort of half did the first time around. It's time to clean them up. Starting with Wave Swinger over by Maverick. Again, I want to give a quick shout out to the Storybrooke Glen Park. Stole a bit of my design from their ride. Theirs was a little bit bulkier than mine. It had a little bit more walls and decorations on it. I wanted to keep mine a little bit simpler because theirs looked a little bit too big, but looking at it now, maybe that was the wrong decision. I'll want to go back and add a little bit more bulk to it at some point. But they use a pretty cool technique of using a broken down Enterprise for the top of the wave swinger, which I think is a pretty cool idea. Worked out pretty well. In addition to just the ride structure itself, I'm also doing a considerable amount of scenery work around the rides today. The more of these buildings we do, the more locked in our layout is, the more comfortable I feel adding down things like fences and trees and everything. And I've just really been enjoying adding these sorts of things in and helping flesh out the park, make everything a little bit more pleasant to look at. It really gives me personally a sense of accomplishment as these things get more complete, which is nice. Although it does make it a little bit more obvious the fact that the layout for my Frontier Town isn't quite perfect. If you look at a map in real life, the lake that Maverick goes through and the lake that Snake River Falls goes into are basically right next to each other with a short bridge between them. But here in my build, they're kind of far apart just because the way everything kind of worked out. Not a huge deal. It's still obvious what everything is and everything is pretty much in the right place. But as always, we're taking some creative liberties with some of our pathing and fences to get everything looking decent. After Wave Swinger, we moved on to Skyhawk, the Scream and Swing ride over next to Cedar Creek Mine Ride. This one's been built and decorated for a while, but after we put together Cedar Creek Mine Ride, I decided that it wasn't in a good spot. It needed to move over about a tile, which is a little bit annoying considering that we already had a bunch of support structures built for it, which I had to tear down and redo. So I spent a good amount of time today rebuilding the ride. I think I rebuilt it 2 or 3 times because after I moved it over tile and decided it was up too high off the ground, it should have been a lot closer to surface level. Not a big deal. It's not a very complicated ride to make, just a little bit annoying. We wound up sticking with the same sort of track architecture for the support structures and everything, so not a whole lot of decisions to make here, just building everything a second time. But it had to be done in order to make sure that there was enough room for all of our queues and exit paths and everything. As I've mentioned before, some of these areas are starting to get a little bit cramped. And especially back here, guests are getting a little bit lost trying to find the entrances to these rides. They're a bit buried in real life too. But it is unfortunate that it's causing a little bit of pathfinding issues getting guests back here. So if we can keep things spread out a little bit so we can have as much path in here to get them where they need to go, the better. And speaking of moving rides, Snake River Falls also need to be reorganized. It was a little bit too close to Skyhawk, and there was some gap between it and the path anyway, so I figured we could shift it over a little bit as well. Since its queue is right next to Skyhawk's queue, there definitely wasn't room for it in the original place we had it, so it had to get moved over a little bit. Fortunately, it's an extremely simple ride, so not a huge deal to delete it and rebuild it. As I mentioned previously when we originally came back here and built this area out, I am not doing the figure 8 layout that this ride normally requires since it doesn't have diagonal track pieces, which is very unfortunate. But that does leave us in a pretty good spot for where the layout is anyway. Everything fit pretty snugly back here, so after it was moved and everything, I'm pretty happy with the way things are laid out now. Not a whole lot else to say about Snake River Falls specifically. It's got another big mine-themed station building just like Maverick, so wound up looking pretty similar to a lot of other buildings that we've built in this part of the park. But it makes sense. That's what happens when you have such a big themed area of your park that's all kind of the same. I imagine when we put down some non-ride buildings later on in the next phase, we're going to see a lot of the same stuff happening. Either way, I was pretty happy with this one, especially the tunnel that goes over top of it. Messed around with a couple ideas to get some nice looking wall and roof structures in here. Decorating splash boats can be a bit of a challenge sometimes since they have such large curves. So we're using some diagonal wall trickery here to get some walls built for them, but not a huge deal. Wound up looking pretty nice. Everything is a bit too brown, so I might have to come back and recolor some of this. It's hard to tell exactly what color the supports are. They're kind of a rusty red, which is kind of hard to replicate in RCT. Might come back and make these the Bordeaux red color just to differentiate them from everything else, because this whole area is looking very brown. But that's a tweak. We can make it anytime, so not too worried about that kind of thing right now. Finally, after all of our ride buildings were done today, I decided to get a little creative with the plaza in between all of these areas. Was a little bit inspired by the Google Street View photos I looked at. As I've mentioned before, these photos are very out of date, so I'm not 100% sure if this is even what this area looks like right now. But we got a cute little gazebo here in a little plaza with some trees and things, and it looked pretty nice, and it wasn't too hard to throw all these things down. As I've mentioned before, I've just been really enjoying throwing down scenery and things as we go along, just to kind of improve the visuals for myself. And we can also add some fun little details here, like this little popcorn stand. There's a little cart here in Google Street View. So we have a monorail ride here to replicate that. I've seen that done in a few other parks, but it always looks really nice. It's always very cute to see guests come up to the little monorail car here to get a bucket of popcorn. But anyway, I think that's going to do it for today. Frontier Town is starting to shape up very nicely. And we're almost done with all of our ride buildings too. Just a couple more flat rides to go and one coaster left. Very exciting to get almost done with this phase. So probably just 1 or 2 more episodes left of that. But until then, hope you enjoyed this episode. And as always, if you've got any comments, questions, or suggestions, please let me know. Thanks for watching.